Welcome to the Mies Podcast. I'm your host, Josh Sharkey, the founder and CEO of Mies, the culinary operating system for food professionals. On the show, I'll be interviewing world-class entrepreneurs in the food space that are shifting the paradigm of how we innovate and operate in our industry. Thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show.
Yo, they say art mirrors life with every stroke of the pencil. I'm giving you folks a glimpse into my experiences you could trace like...
My guest today is a chef that you probably know, but if you don't, I think it's incumbent upon all of us in the culinary industry and beyond to get to know what he's doing and the impact that he's driving in the U.S. Dan Giusti is the founder of Brigaid, an organization dedicated to helping institutional food service like public schools and prisons create delicious, wholesome food and generally just thrive as food service operators. And there's a catch here. Prior to founding Brigaid, Dan did not have a background in institutional food service. Rather, he was the chef cuisine of NOMA restaurant, lauded, of course, as the best restaurant in the world for quite some time. Dan spent the majority of his career working in the upper echelon of fine dining. That said, I think he actually values his leadership and management skills far more than he does his creativity as a chef. In getting to know Dan, I can tell you that he's also one of the most humble people you will ever meet. Dan and I talk about what it's like working in these school systems and where there's opportunity for improvement. And more importantly, Dan continually praises the incredible people that are working in these food service establishments. On top of that, we discuss what it really means to be a chef and where our responsibilities lie, how reviews and rewards can sometimes have a negative impact on the motivations of chefs. And we spent a lot of time talking about his plight to improve the food system in America. I'm really grateful that we have chefs like Dan using their craft to effectuate positive change in our food system. And I learned a lot, and I hope you enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. Maybe if we could start like how you got to Brigaid, because you started at Clyde's, CAA, back to Clyde's, Guy Savoy, back to Clyde's again. You probably worked at Clyde's like 600 times before you...
I did work at Clyde's a few times, yeah.
Went to NOMA, and then somehow from NOMA to Brigaid. So I would love to hear, like, how did that happen?
I started working in restaurants when I was 15, and that was at Clyde's of Georgetown in Washington, D.C. I happened to be going to high school in Northern Virginia at the time. So I became interested in cooking, primarily because I come from a big Italian family where I have some folks in my family who are really good cooks. I would consider them above your stereotypical good home cook. So some folks really are strong cooks. So I just became interested in it at a young age. And I went to a high school where people were really ambitious and really talking about career goals and colleges freshman year of high school. So I started doing the same. And because of my interest in cooking, I thought, why not give that a shot? I had the opportunity to kind of go to a career fair. I met a representative from the Culinary Institute of America. So that woman told me that I should get a job. So I got a job. I can't really remember. I think actually she knew the corporate chef of Clyde's and she put me in touch with him, at which point I was able to apply. And then I got a job. So I started working in kitchens when I was 15. In that kitchen, I was primarily doing a lot of prep work the first year that I worked there. So just cutting things and whatnot. And really through high school, I continued working at Giusti of Georgetown and worked my way up. And by the time I was a senior in high school, I was doing most of the work in that kitchen. So working all the different stations on the line. And that restaurant is a very, very busy restaurant. I would say that stations that I worked at during certain services were some of the hardest things I probably have ever done in my career, like working the grill station during Saturday brunch was always interesting because I had a big grill, and on each side, on the left side and the right side of the grill, I had 4-inch hotel pans with water that you would poach eggs. So on that station, you would do burgers, toast buns, cook burgers to temperature, and then you would also do eggs Benedict. So you toast English muffins, do eggs Benedict. You would get rocked. It was like super busy. I learned a good amount in high school. By 18, I was pretty good. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, not amazing, but I would say that if I worked that station now, I would probably struggle. And then when I was a senior, I applied to go to the Culinary Institute of America. I got accepted. I only applied to one school, and then I went there. So really leading up to CIA, though, my kind of idea of working in restaurants was just I enjoyed being in a restaurant. I enjoyed the environment. I enjoyed cooking. By that time, I was involved with, coming up with maybe like the soup of the day. I would make the soup of the day and would get great feedback on it. And that was amazing to hear that positive feedback. So for me, that's what working in a restaurant was. It wasn't about, I didn't really know much about famous chefs or fine dining restaurants. It's just, it was a little bit of a different time. This was in 2002. This is like kind of network was just kind of coming about, but it wasn't like now where you see all these Netflix shows and all these famous chefs. But then I went to culinary school, and it, like, literally, I swear it was like the day I got to CIA, people were talking about like, where are you going to go on your internship in basically like 5 to 6 months. And it was all about, all these restaurants, a lot of which were in New York City, and where are you going to do your internship? And do you know who this chef is? And it kind of like boggled my mind because I wasn't familiar with all these places. But very quickly, being an ambitious person, I was like, okay, let's start researching these restaurants. This is what it's about, I guess. Like, I'm going to be successful as a chef. Like, this is the direction I need to go. And so that's kind of really put me on this trajectory of starting to really think about a career in fine dining. I did my internship at Oriole in New York City, and that was my first taste of like working in a more kind of upscale restaurant. I was there for a few months for this internship, and I really liked it. Went back to school, finished school, went to Italy for close to a year, worked in a Michelin star restaurant there, really liked it. Came back from Italy, went to work for Clyde's again in one of their big restaurants that had 500 seats. So it was a different one. And I really liked it. I liked that environment. Because I think I always liked the management component of working in restaurants too. So in a bigger restaurant, there was a lot of people, there were systems, and I think I really enjoyed that. But I still had this itch for like fine dining. So Clyde's is not a fine dining restaurant. Part of the Clyde's restaurant group, there's 1789 restaurant, which is also in Georgetown, which is their fine dining restaurant. So from that Clyde's, I went to 1789 as a sous chef. From there, I went to work in Las Vegas at Guy Savoy. That was in like the 2007-8 period where a lot of big time French chefs opened restaurants in Las Vegas. So that was cool to go there. That was probably at the time, Oriole was fine dining, but going to Guy Savoy, like, everybody was wearing like, laundered braggart jackets, and then there was carpet in the kitchen and granite countertops and Molteni stoves. And that was my first kind of introduction to like that level. And I was like, this is wild. I didn't particularly enjoy living in Las Vegas. So I was really just there for a year, went back to 1789 now as the head chef. They hired me as the head chef, and I was 24 at the time. And that restaurant had been there forever. And this is like a really well-established restaurant in Washington, D.C. that was very well known for rack of lamb and Caesar salad and creme brulee. And I came back like a cocky 24-year-old from Las Vegas. And I was like taking everything off the menu, changing the menu. And I would chalk up my 3.5-year tenure at 1789 as like maybe one of the biggest growing experiences in my life. It's like in terms of personal things, like becoming an adult. I did a lot of things because I thought it made sense, and I was trying to change a restaurant that didn't need to change. And it was tough. It was a tough time for me in that I think I just kind of missed the mark in a lot of ways. And I learned a lot. I learned a lot about people. And basically, after about 3 years, I was like, I still had this itch. I was like, I want to go work in a restaurant. I want to go higher. I want to go see if I could work, at the top. They basically made a list of restaurants, and it was, at the time, it was NOMA, it was the Fat Duck, and Alinea. I wrote to all three of them. Now, being someone who had worked at Guy Savoy, and that was really the only place I worked of note, thinking I'm going to write to these three restaurants, two of which were in different countries, was pretty ambitious. The Fat Duck, I never heard from them. Alinea, I was able to set up a kind of a 2-day trial to go there. And then at NOMA, I was able to kind of get in there and schedule like a 2-week trial. So went to Alinea. It wasn't necessarily my cup of tea. It was cool what they were doing. I just don't think it was like my style. Like, I didn't really fit in there, I guess, maybe. But I also was planning to go to NOMA a couple weeks later. So I went to NOMA, loved it. Basically went back without a promise of a job, went back to DC, quit my job at 1789, moved to Copenhagen, was able to get a job at the very kind of bottom level upon getting to Copenhagen. And then really after about 8 months, I was considering what my next step was, because I didn't really think I was particularly doing a great job. At the time, I think I was like 28, 29. Most of the people there were like 21, 22, running circles around me. I had been in a job that really became primarily administrative at 1789. So I was rusty. Like, I didn't think I was doing an excellent job.
Yeah.
After 8 months, I was like, I went to the head chef at the time, and I was kind of like, hey, I don't know if, I'm doing a great job here. I think, should I leave? And he basically told me that that he was leaving within the year, and they wanted me to become the next head chef. So within 8 months of being there, I was kind of told that this was going to be my new role. And, it was just as daunting as it was exciting. And then, basically for the next 6 to 7 months, they brought me up to the level where they wanted me to become the head chef, and I became the head chef and then held that position for 3 years.
Well, what was the gap of so you thought you were doing terrible. They thought you should run the kitchen. What was it that you thought was going so wrong that they didn't?
I think for me, I'm a very self-critical person, and I saw a lot of people around me who knew a lot more than I did. They were more experienced than I was in terms of the ingredients we were using or different techniques. I think up until that point in my career, I never looked too much into maybe my abilities beyond the kitchen, whether they be like organizational or from a character perspective or leadership perspective or management perspective. It's not something I don't think I ever really looked at in myself. I do very much now. I find that those are really my strengths. And in a place like NOMA, when you're there, you see all these people that are just so talented when it comes to food that it's hard not to just compare yourself to them in that sense. And that's what I did. And by no means was I ever even close to the most talented person there. There were so many people that were so talented and incredible when it came to food and so creative. And that wasn't me. So I think for me, I thought I fell short in that sense. But in other ways, I think I had a lot of strengths. I think that's where it came from. They saw someone that could be in charge and could lead the kitchen. And I just didn't see that in myself at that point in my career.
Isn't that so interesting how the old saying, comparison's the enemy of joy. So much of what we struggle with is internal.
It was crazy because I literally, when I really think back at that moment, I'd spent a lot of effort to try to get there, to try to get to NOMA. And then I was finally there. And that first 7 months or so was really hard for me, but it did fly by. And then to think, I remember man, I'm going to have this conversation now. Should I even be here anymore? This kind of seems silly. I was so in that mindset that things were not right and things weren't going well. And I just had no idea that in fact, they really were. And I just didn't see it at all. And when I look back in retrospect, now I feel like I'm so in tune to kind of what's going on around me and where I stack up and very self-aware. And I don't know what it was, but at the time I clearly was not.
Can you pinpoint some of those leadership skills or management that are sort of some of your superpowers? It's obviously it's a different skill set, right?
I think one of the things that I have become good at, and I think I was good at that and maybe just didn't realize it as much, is I think first of all, it's this idea of being okay with and understanding that you don't need to be the best at everything. And if you are leading a team of people, that in fact, it's extremely important that you understand your own limitations and can really utilize and take advantage of the people around you and your team. Say, wow, okay, this person's, and not let your ego get in the way of that. It's very easy to be well, I don't want to recognize that this person next to me is better at this than me. I don't want to do that. But if you can't do that, then that means you can't really take full advantage of the people on your team. So if you have someone next to you who's better at something than you are, and you're okay with recognizing that, it's wow, okay, well, I have a gap here. I'm not very good at this, but this person's excellent at it. So let's utilize that. I think that's really important to be very self-aware, know what your strengths and weaknesses are, and know how collectively as a team you can do things and how that works. And I think that also allows you to determine and decide what maybe you need to work on. Because I think sometimes as a leader, you can get caught up in working on things that maybe you don't really need to work on. And then that kind of gets in the way of working on things that you actually do need to work on, that you are the only one that's going to be able to provide that function to that group or that team. So I think for me, particularly in a place like NOMA, that was really important because there were so many people that were better at a lot of things than I was. And I needed to recognize that, not only recognize it, but embrace that. I think there's a big difference too, but recognizing it and then really embracing it and being okay, I've got all these people at my disposal to make this happen on a daily basis. And that's kind of how I do things till this day. It's just being self-aware and not letting that be a negative thing. I think it could be very easy to look at someone and say, wow, they're better at this than I am. It doesn't need to be a negative thing. That's just, because I'm a firm believer that we all have strengths. We all have weaknesses. The person next to you might be better at something than you are, but surely you're better at something than they are. And that's just how the world works. We all have our strengths. So I think embracing that and using that to your advantage is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And you said self-aware, but I think also like being humble. You're clearly like the first time we met, that's the first thing that I felt was like this humbleness to you, which you have to be if you're going to run a kitchen like NOMA, because everybody is at a really high level, and you have to be to build something like Brigade.
You got to be humble. You got to be humble. And I think to a fault, sometimes I can be humble. I think sometimes you do have to step up and you are in charge, you're a leader, and people want that. People want to see that. People want to see you. But I think for me, a big part of being self-aware, you have to be humble because you have to recognize the fact that there are people that are always going to be better at things than you are. And that's wrong with that.
Yeah.
The more comfortable you are in that, I think the stronger you can be as a leader. Like the more comfortable because I think if you're not comfortable with that, you reach for things, you get involved with things, or you're using brain power and you're getting frustrated about things that just waste energy. If you're comfortable with who you are and what you're capable of, and you can just stand behind that, you're not wasting any energy.
Yeah, 100%. And I think the idea of just also being okay with it is so important. I don't think you could have started Brigade if you weren't someone that was okay knowing that, like, yeah, there are people that it's just like any sort of entrepreneur. Like I feel the same thing. Like no business would ever be started if the first question was, is somebody more equipped than me to do this? Is someone better than me at X, Y, and Z? Because if you dwell on that, you would never fucking start Brigade. You know?
Sometimes part of the strength of a person is like, I started Brigade. I started it. No one else started it. I started it. I think you need to that's a strength to make a decision at a certain point in time and do it. That's a strength. And I think there are too many people sometimes questioning themselves like, oh, no, good for you. Like you made a decision and you went for it and you did it. That's something to be excited about and something to celebrate, I think, all in itself.
100%. Let's dig into Brigade a little bit because, and to start, because we're going to talk a lot about like what it's like in the school system, the people, the kitchens. There's probably a lot that's very different from working at NOMA or Clyde's or anywhere like that. To start, maybe what's the same? Like, what is the same about what you do today relative to what you were doing in kitchens? Whether that's sort of like how you go about your starting a day, emotionally, tactically, like, is there lineups? Like, what about like what you do today is like the same?
I think in terms of like the physical aspect, the motions I go through on a daily basis probably couldn't be more different than they are now. In terms of working in a restaurant as a chef of a restaurant of a singular kitchen versus being an entrepreneur who has chefs working in organizations all around the country, my role is very different as well. The organization is very different. So in terms of the physical aspect of it, I don't think it could be any more different. I think a lot of the work I do is very much rooted in communication, speaking with people, meeting folks in kitchens, whether they're staff in kitchens or people running food service programs. I don't do a tremendous amount of hands-on work with food anymore. I just don't. That's not part of my role. But I think in terms of the mindset, I think it's very similar. And that's a thing that I try to preach with our team. I try to preach as we look to get more chefs to join our team, is this idea of when I was at NOMA, there was kind of no limit as to how good things could be. The expectation was that they were right. There was like a right and a wrong. It was either as good as it can be or it wasn't good enough. And that was the expectation of guests. They would come in and their expectation what it was going to be the best meal they've ever eaten in their life. And it was day in and day out, lunch and dinner, every single plate, trying to make them as good as they could be every single day. And I think that thinking should be applied across the board. And that what I try to preach when it comes to what we do now is you might be making a sandwich, literally heating something up, but the only limit to how much thought you can put into that comes from you. It comes from you and you only. If you want to decide that you want to obsess about how to heat something up that's in a bag, then you can do that. And the only reason not to do that is from you. It's no one else. So like we encounter this idea often that, and I hear it from most people, to be honest, and I think it goes across not just food, but anything really, it's like, if you're going to spend a lot of money on food, then a lot of thought should be put into that food. If you're getting a lunch for free at a school, then maybe you don't need to put so much thought into that. That's, again, just a decision. Now, of course, logistically and financially, there might not be as much money to be able to put into paying people to spend as much time as they can spend on something in say, a kitchen like NOMA, where you have a research kitchen, all this thing. But individually, on a kind of just an individual basis, you put as much thought into something as you want. And that's something that I preach a lot. And I think that's how mentally I approach my days now. Everything I do, it's kind of like, man, did we do this as good as we could have done it? Did we do this as well as we could have done it? And that's really kind of something I fell into when I was at NOMA. That was a mindset that was ingrained in me, and I don't think that will ever go away.
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting, like the paradigm shift that can happen. Having good food in not just schools, but any institution.
Anywhere. I mean, it's the context. It's like, yes, the budget in a school is different, so therefore the food's going to be different. It's different people we're feeding. We're feeding kids, then we're feeding, these traveled diners. But again, within that context, it's like you can still approach it the same way. And I think that's where there's a disconnect.
Scarcity has usually bred the most innovation throughout time. And I think we talked about this last time, but for me, it reminds me of like when a cook comes into your kitchen, within 5 minutes if they're a good cook, and it's not because of something you tasted. It's the way they walk, up to their station. It's the way that they open the box. It's how they put their side towel down and are there right angles. And it's the way that they open a bag, right? Those things all matter. And that's actually usually indicative of someone that's a really good cook. I bet that there's probably a ton of people working in those schools that have been there for years that either have the same propensity or actually do that already.
100%. I mean, a lot of the folks we meet in school kitchens cook at home, and they're great home cooks. And they've just been, the way things are set up at the schools, it's not really conducive to them, like being able to show off what they can do. And that's for a lot of reasons. That's not the school's fault. There's nutritional guidelines, there's budgets, they might not have the right equipment in place and so on. But we meet so many people, and it's so cool and it's so fun when you go into a kitchen and you see someone doing something that they don't even recognize that what they're doing is so it just makes you smile. It's so exciting. A lot of the schools we work in, for example, do use kitchen towels, and we'll go into some kitchens and you'll see all the towels and they've been folded perfectly in their order. You're just awesome. It's so cool to see little things like that where people are working in a way that's just such at a high level. And the best part about it is no one's giving them recognition. No one's asking them to do that. They just do it because that's the kind of person they are. That for them, no one's even told them that this is a good way to do something. They're just naturally doing things in a way that makes sense to them, and they're just sharp. And I think of through all the times working in restaurants, meeting cooks, young cooks who are so ambitious and passionate. And I hate to say it, but you would try to really get some of these themes into some of these cooks' heads. And some people just don't think that way. It's a real struggle for them to work in a certain way. And then we go into these school kitchens and you just meet people who very naturally are just doing things in a very particular way. And they're just very organized and they're very smooth with it. It's very cool to see.
And it really does sort of bridge the gap of skill set, to your point. There are a lot of cooks that you can ferment a piece of kohlrabi and put some dish together with that. But if you want to make a ham and cheese sandwich, it might not be good.
Yeah, it's crazy. But honestly, Josh, I think that comes down to desire to there are people who are just disinterested in certain types of food. Food's a funny thing, and I've come to realize this, and I'm not going to go off on a tangent, but it's really, I think, very specific. The passion of cooking can be very specific. I think people say I'm passionate about cooking, but I think when they say that, a lot of people are passionate about cooking. They're passionate about cooking in a certain way. They're not passionate about cooking in general. They would be passionate about fermenting that piece of kohlrabi and making a dish out of it. But like you said, not passionate about assembling a ham and cheese sandwich the best way they could.
This podcast is brought to you by Mies, the culinary operating system for food professionals. As a chef and restaurant owner for the past 20 years, I was frustrated that the only technology that we had in the kitchen was financial or inventory software. Those are important, but they don't address the actual process of cooking, training, collaboration, and consistent execution. So I decided if it didn't exist, I'd do my best to get it built, so the current and next generation of culinary pros have a digital tool dedicated to their craft. If you're a chef, mixologist, operator, or generally if you manage recipes intended for professional kitchens, Mies is built just for you. Organize, share, prep, and scale your recipes like never before, and get laser-accurate food costs and nutrition analysis faster than you could imagine. Learn more at www.getmies.com. You know what? You went on a tangent, and this is something I was going to ask you at the end, but I'm just going to ask it now because I've been thinking about it so much over the last couple of years, really. Why do we cook, right? Because for me, I actually love the mise en place part of it, and knowing that I have this list to do, and in my timing when this is going to go in the oven, and knowing there's a braise going overnight, knowing I have to taste this sauce, and this thing is marinating, that feeling, right? It's intrinsic. It is sort of still narcissistic. It's not as narcissistic maybe as taste my food, do you like it? But we come from the same era, right? We started cooking in 99, 2000, 98, whatever. We didn't do it because we were going to go be a famous chef. That didn't exist back then. But we wanted something out of it that was gratifying, right? We wanted to be the best chef. We wanted to make sure people loved our food. And I think about why over time, why do we continue to cook? And I wanted to ask you, have you thought about why are you a chef? You could do a lot of things. And now you're more than just a chef, obviously, but why are you in this industry?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, I told my story and I didn't realize this and that, but I think when I really think about it, maybe it's not you didn't realize why you started cooking. I think it probably changes, what brings you joy cooking. And I think for me now, like I said, I don't do a ton of cooking per se now, but in terms of working with food and being part of preparing food, I think I'm into a lot of that stuff too. If it comes to actually working in a kitchen or if I'm cooking at home, I get a lot of joy out of getting organized and putting things together in a certain way. And I like that process. That's something that, that's exciting to me. I think there was definitely a time where one of the most important things for me was being a part of making food that people were impressed by. That was for a good amount of time. That was something that was really important to me, that I was in a place where we were preparing food that people were blown away by. They're like, wow, that's impressive. That was important to me. And so I think that changes. And I think now what's most important to me, it's kind of knowing that you have a certain experience and ability and sharing that with someone. That's important to me now. I think so much of the work we do is based in this idea of whether the experience of our company or usually it's really the experience of the individual chefs who work on our team, and then being able to share that with staff in these kitchens, and then inherently that leading to food quality improving. And it's sharing it. It's sharing what you know. To me, that's really important to me. And I think utilizing my experience to someone's benefit. And I think that can be done in a variety of ways. And I think for me right now, the way that we do that is through working with food service programs to help them reach their goals of improving food quality. And that's how we use our experience to benefit others. And that's, I think, for me, the most important thing now. But when I worked at Clyde's, I think I genuinely just that was a busy restaurant. And I genuinely liked the idea of working in a busy restaurant where it was fast paced and you had to be organized and there were systems in place in those restaurants. To me, that was extremely fulfilling. So I think you probably go through different stages of your career where cooking becomes fulfilling in different ways.
That's so smart. Yeah, there are different stages of your career as a cook. And to your point, though, I think that it doesn't last forever, that sort of external gratification, right? So I think that's something for chefs and cooks to consider, especially when they consider possibly coming and working with Brigade, right? Relying on external gratification to be happy is really dangerous, right? If that's what you're looking for, it's fleeting, right? Where I think that, with what you're doing, there's an opportunity to find joy by actually having an impact. And that's not fleeting. That lasts.
It's also, I think, what I've come to realize is that, and I've been more outspoken about this recently, is that the way this external gratification comes, I don't know. It's is basing your emotions and if you're feeling good or not, and your success, basing that off of an individual's opinion, one person who might write an article or a group of people, or that's tough. And, there's a lot of reasons why ratings are the way they are, and there's a lot of reasons why top 50 lists are the way they are. And is that what you want to base your whole life on? And I think one of many things I've come to really love in the institutional space, it's a very transparent space, for good or for bad. If kids don't like the food, you know about it. Kids love it. There's really no nonsense at play. No one's getting caught up in anything.
Yeah.
I get it. To be a chef who puts blood, sweat, and tears into cooking, and you work so hard just for someone to write something that they want to write, or even these days, it's very easy, obviously, to have influence just by being someone who has a following on social media. To base everything that you do off of those opinions, that's tough. That's a tough way to live. And I don't think anyone should be living a life where they're judging their own success and themselves based off of an individual's opinion. When I was at NOMA, I mean, I would live just searching and scouring reviews of the restaurant and knowing who had eaten in the restaurant on Instagram and what did they think. And like, I could handle that. I could handle it. But I also don't think that like that leads you in the right direction. Like if you're basing your future and where you want to go with your career and your life off of what you read someone thinks about your food on Instagram, I don't know if that's taking you in the right direction, and that's going to ultimately lead to you being happy and being successful in your own mind, because that's what's most important, that like you feel successful for yourself.
There's a big difference between feedback, like curating the right kind of feedback, as opposed to reviews or accolades, because you need feedback. You want to walk to a table and say, hey, how is that? And here is great, but it's a little acidic. Okay, if I hear that a couple times, maybe, because food, it is sort of subjective, but some things are objective. You also can't really be truly like putting your food out if the way that you make decisions is based on an arbitrary review.
I'm assuming that's what a lot of people do. I mean, people who are like, I want to get 3 Michelin stars. And I'm not knocking people who have 3 Michelin stars, but like they're kind of like ways to go out and get that 3 Michelin stars. They're like things that these people want to see. Is people are working towards getting these accolades, working in that direction. And I think, a lot of chefs out there are very much influenced by that kind of thing. And I understand why, not only because obviously that feels good, but also that's going to drive business. And if you start a business, you want to drive business, and it's like a cycle. And like, so I get it. I don't want to knock chefs for chasing these things at all. But I just wonder, like at a certain point, it would always kill me, like honestly, like to be very honest, like when I was at NOMA, Renee, who's the chef of NOMA, of course, I would just look at him and I'm like, everything he accomplished in such a short period of time. And, we're sitting there and I would just think of like, someone would say something on Instagram or someone would say something on a review. And part of me, I was like, why does he even care? He has accomplished so much. He is, like, in my opinion, he's a genius. And to think that there's these chefs out there who have accomplished so much and worked so hard and are so talented, that someone in a very casual and really kind of reckless way can just write something somewhere. And then that somehow has influence on this person's mind. It's pretty crazy to think about.
Yeah, and I agree. Like, first of all, it's about intention. It's not wrong to have 3 Michelin stars. I think if you love this and you're devoted to it, I think that's incredible. It's about the right intent. But part of that, I think, is also human nature. No matter what, Renee is a genius, and his food has changed the way we think about food. Some writer who has never cooked a day in their life, who might even this be their first job, and that could impact. It's less about, I think, about Renee, just more about it's part of human nature, is that once you're in that environment, it's tough. It's hard to sort of, distinguish between the two. And if that guy was sitting in a room with Renee, he'd probably never say that.
Sometimes I'll read an article and I'll like look the person up, and they're, not say there's anything wrong with people being young, but to think that like you can be like 23 years old and like write a scathing article about a restaurant that could literally ruin a restaurant, and maybe not have all the facts or not completely understand it, or not really have the experience to understand the full depth of what you're talking about. That's the world we live in. Like, that's okay. Like, that works now. Like, you can do that. Like, if I'm a chef in a restaurant, that's a tough reality to wake up to every day.
It's also not isolated to being a chef. Anytime we put ourselves out there, anytime we do something, Elon Musk just like changed the entire world yesterday, launched a rocket that it ended up exploding, but like the ability to get to Mars is now possible. No one else is testing that. No one else is building these kinds of rockets. But the headlines are rocket explodes and it's a disaster. Yet we like literally broke new ground, and you start a brigade. There's probably lots of people, maybe on the other side of the coin, they're like, school systems are never going to change. Why are you wasting your time? Who's this fancy chef trying to like change the school system? No matter what we do, you put yourselves out there, there's always going to be people that put you down. But it's also like how you let it affect you. Choose not to be harmed and you won't be. We went off on a bit of a tangent. I didn't mean to go down the NOMA rabbit hole, but I'm glad we did a little bit, and maybe we'll circle back on it. But I want to get back into brigade. I want to learn some more about like what goes on there. So you talked about before about like you started it at 1789 and you changed the whole menu. I think as chefs, a lot of us have made this mistake where we step in and we just change everything without like learning people's names or why this dish is the way it was. And is there a reason that customers keep ordering it? I'm sure you learned a lot from that. Fast forward, you start a brigade. I got to imagine you step into these kitchens in schools and you're like, okay, holy shit, there's a million things that I need to do. Did you start off that way of, okay, I'm going to take my time? Or did you jump in full force and then have to sort of learn the hard way again?
As much as I learned at 1789 in that experience, I definitely didn't learn enough, maybe, because the first interaction we had, and when I first started brigade, I hired 2 chefs, and we hired them. They started in June, and we were getting ready for the following school year, which would have been the first time we'd ever cooked in a school. And our idea was, you know what, that we're going to start slow. We don't really know how things work. So I think our intentions were right. We don't know what we're doing. This is the first time we're going to do it. Let's look at the menus. Let's see maybe if there's some small stuff we can change. And the more we looked at the menu, ego got the best of us. We changed it, basically the whole thing. Really not taking into consideration, first of all, the fact that we had no idea what we were doing and really no idea what to expect when it came to starting in the schools. We had no idea what kids were going to enjoy, what they weren't going to enjoy. We really had no statistical information from the previous years, which that was on us because they had that information. Like some of these things that we were taking off the menu, the kids really enjoyed. But it's like it didn't matter to us. We're like, this isn't what we want to serve to kids, so we're going to just take it off the menu. We didn't take into consideration the staff, what this would mean to them by making these changes, and would it become overwhelming? And so needless to say, we did all these things and we started the school year, and it was a bit of a disaster. The one place we were successful was we were making meals that we could, and we weren't even doing it consistently, but we could put together a few meals and take a picture of them and show them on social media. And people thought that was cool. People were like, wow, it's pretty amazing that you can make this meal from scratch for $1.25. That's where we were successful. A lot of the food we were serving, the kids didn't enjoy. There were a lot of kids who depended on meals, who were choosing not to eat because the food that we were serving at the time, they didn't feel comfortable with. The staff felt very overwhelmed, and that was a lot for them. So really anything that could have gone wrong, I would say, went wrong because we did not really think it through, and we just wanted to come in as chefs and kind of do what we thought was best.
Look, I think we probably all would have done a little bit of that. How does it work today when you step into a new school?
Yeah, so now it's so different. The first step, we do what we call an assessment. So whether it's 2 schools in a school district or 150 schools in a school district, we go to every single school. We look at the equipment. We look at the size of the school. We basically try to get the gist of the whole program collectively. You know, in a lot of these school districts, you might have one school that has all the equipment in the world and another school it has a warmer, and that's it. So in order to really be able to give proper suggestions and advise, we need to understand the full extent of what's going on. So looking at all the kitchens first, understanding the labor models, understanding the menus, interviewing people when they're available. So understanding what's successful, what's not successful. And then really moving into the most important part is, this is your program. So speaking to X school district, this is your program. Where is it at right now in your mind? What's going well? What's not going well? What are your goals for this program? So everything we do in the context of what they're trying to get to.
Who's the you in that equation?
What's that?
Whose goals? Is it the school system's goals?
School system goals. So, in the beginning, I did have this idea of we brigade are going to have this model where we're going to go implement this model across the country. This is how it's going to work. So we quickly went away from that once we realized that every community is different. Every food service program is different. And who am I to go into whatever part of the country and say, this is how you should feed your community. This is how you should work with your staff. Now, obviously, we have a certain level of expertise, and obviously there's a certain level of expectation from brigade and our chefs to advise on things. That's what we get paid to do. But it's always done by asking questions first. What are you trying to achieve? Do you like serving this food? Is this particular meal something you're excited about? It is. Perfect. That's great. Let's keep it on the menu. This is something you're not excited about. Well, let's find an alternative to it. And really trying to gather as much information as possible. That's why so much of what we do is based on the chefs we hire. We don't have some slick model that we're trying to implement that's like a cookie cutter thing that we put in place in different districts. It's the people. We hire chefs that we feel are strong chefs that have the right experience and the right background when it comes to working in a kitchen, but they also have the right character to go into this situation as a representative of an outside organization and to work with the food service programs, help them reach their goals. And that can mean very different things in very different places. Some school districts we work with really are already doing a lot of scratch cooking and they really have a lot of great systems implemented. Some don't. Some, they're really at those beginning stages. So of course, where we start can be very different from place to place.
Yeah, absolutely. If you don't mind, I'm just going to ask some random questions just because I'm just curious. How's the government involved? Is there are you subsidized at all? And is there regulations to do you have to get approvals for the food that you're cooking? Or?
Yeah. So basically in a nutshell, the way it works is there's what's called the National School Lunch Program, and that's administered by the USDA federal level. So if you're a school district, which most public school districts participate in the National School Lunch Program, if you're a school district participating in that program and you serve a meal that meets specific nutritional guidelines, these guidelines are given to the school districts, you get a certain amount of money back from the government. If you do not meet those guidelines, you don't get that money. So basically, that's how it works. So all of these school districts participating in the National School Lunch Program follow these guidelines. There is a system in place to prove that they are following these guidelines. So there's a good amount of administrative work that needs to be done, and basically proving that you're following the nutritional guidelines, that you're documenting how many meals you're preparing, you're documenting how many meals you're actually serving. This information goes to the government, usually first through the state, and then you get a reimbursement back from the government. So the way it works, and this is an important fact that I think most people don't understand, is you have a school district, and that school district has its own budget, its own fund. But in the vast majority of cases, that money never touches the food service program. The vast majority of cases, the food service program's budget is entirely based off of that reimbursement from the government that is specifically for food service. So when you hear these arguments and sometimes where people are like, well, does it make sense to use money for the food or for new computers? It's really not the same thing. It's really a budget. And usually the only time the general budget of the school district will support the food service program is if they absolutely have to, meaning that really the food service program is run like a business. If they're not keeping up and they're losing, then the kids still need to eat. So then the general fund will put money into it. But you're really kind of on an island with that set amount of money.
So there's guidelines, which means there's arbiters of who those guidelines are. Are you thinking about, or maybe you are already, getting involved with what those guidelines are, changing them if there's things that you feel that you believe could be changed?
Yeah, I'll say I haven't been very involved. And at this point, I feel like we as an organization should be more involved. We should be more vocal. I guess my thinking on it always has been I never want to get to a point where we're spending more time thinking about those kinds of things than we are thinking about the food that we're preparing for kids today. So there's no question that these changes take a long time and we should be involved. We should be more in that conversation of making changes. I think for the most part, the guidelines themselves aren't outrageous. I think they can always be better. They can always be in a very simple way where things are going now. And one of the kind of the most restrictive guidelines that makes it difficult to make delicious food is the sodium requirement. So they're actually looking to reduce sodium further, the allotment of sodium further, which quite frankly, it makes it difficult to make a meal that kids will eat and enjoy eating. So yeah, we should be more involved in that. We're not super involved. We're not super involved in advocacy work or policy work. Really would say that our main focus has been really just, I don't want to say head down, but kind of head down in the schools, work in the districts. That being said, a lot of the districts we work with have their food service director is someone who is very involved in these conversations. And I will say that it's probably, to be honest, more effective for them to be involved in those conversations because they represent a school district, whereas we represent a private company. Through proxy, we are involved in the conversations because Obviously we have conversations with these folks in terms of what's working, what's not working, but it's definitely a big thing. And there's a lot of money at play as well as if you can imagine that one of the parts of the guidelines is we have to offer 5 components for a meal. You have to offer a protein, you have to offer a grain, you have to offer a fruit, you have to offer a vegetable, and you have to offer a milk. So I ended with a milk because that obviously it tells you something there that like part of what you have to offer. So there's a lot of business at play, a lot of things happening there.
Yeah, that's interesting. The salt one's a tough one. I mean, my kids, they eat Maldon salt like it's candy. So
Yes.
sodium is...
Well, it's tough because you end up in a place where you just wonder, like, look, I'm not the most healthy human being on earth, but I've turned out well. Like sometimes I ate sweet things as a kid. Sometimes, I ate candy. I ate things that have enough salt to make them taste good. And I do think we are going down a road with some of this food sometimes where I'm just wondering, like, is this necessary? There is a problem across the country. There are significant health problems across the country. But is it completely related to some of the adjustments that are being made? I don't know. I don't know if one really knows.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you said something the first time we spoke that essentially like your primary goal is make sure the kids are eating.
That's a good point, Josh, because I think when people think of the National School Lunch Program, the conversation is primarily about nutrition. And don't get me wrong, when we're feeding kids, we want that to go hand in hand with good nutrition. Of course we do. Proper nutrition, of course we do. And that oftentimes the case, that's how it happens. But if we do need to discern between making sure a child eats versus the nutrition piece, then we'll do it. Meaning, like, for example, cereal is always a great one. Kids really want to eat cereal that is the name brand cereal that all kids like, the Cinnamon Toast Crunch and these things. And, are they the best things for you? No, they're not. But if it's the difference between a kid eating breakfast who maybe has not eaten since the day before lunch at school and not eating breakfast, then in my opinion, then that's okay. There are plenty of folks out there who will tell you that it's better off they don't eat that at all. And I completely disagree with that. And I think that's coming from a place of ignorance, to be completely honest with you, because if you see kids who aren't eating, it's pretty hard to say, oh yeah, you know what? Like, I rather them just continue to not eat than eat a cereal that has a little bit of sugar in it. Like, it's just kind of crazy.
It is a tough conversation. I mean, I'm a parent of 2 children, and I'll tell you, my son, there's so many things he won't eat.
Yeah.
I would kill for him to eat some cereal if it meant that over not eating breakfast, because there are like breakfast and lunch will pass by where he just doesn't want to eat any of it. And I'm like, just please eat something. I'll take Cinnamon Toast Crunch over nothing any day.
Sometimes I'll post things on Instagram where we made like a cinnamon roll from scratch and served it for breakfast. And people are like, well, that's great, but is that really what we should be serving kids? Where did we get to a place where eating a cinnamon roll every once in a while was something we can't do? I think that's very odd to me.
Obviously, it's all moderation, but either way, I'm sure it's a lot of stress. So, okay, a couple more, even more random questions, and then I'm going to move on here. So it's Monday to Friday. How do you operate a kitchen where everything is done on Friday after school and you nothing happens on the weekends?
Yeah, it's tough. It definitely mentally, it's an interesting thing. I mean, for sure, you're planning in a way where, first of all, Monday's menus are just significantly easier than the rest of the week. One thing that's actually very different that we've seen in school kitchens than, say, a restaurant kitchen is it's a pretty common practice. No matter what's going on, it's Tuesday. This is what we're serving for lunch. We're going to make it today. It's Tuesday, and that's it. There's no advanced prep. So a big thing that we work on with school districts is Monday's menu is light because it's Monday and we just came out of the weekend and you have nothing really prepared in advance. So Monday menu is light. We have the afternoon to kind of get ready for Tuesday or Wednesday, Thursday. And there's no days that are what you'll see in a lot of school kitchens. There's days that are crazy busy and it's super chaotic. And then there's days where nothing's happening. And we try to get everybody to even that out. So yeah, it's different. And that's something we see actually often when we do assessments in school districts where the staff will tell you, they're I don't know why, the director made this the menu on Monday. It's too hard to come into. And they're right. It's a difficult menu to come into on a Monday. But there are ways. I mean, there are things that, for example, if we're doing baked goods and things like that, we'll put baked dry ingredient kits together. So on Friday afternoon, it's a little slower because we're not getting ready for the next day of service. So it's okay, well, on Monday, we're baking muffins. Let's get all the dry ingredients weighed out, measured out, whatever we can do, we get ahead on. But it's difficult. I mean, anybody who's worked in a restaurant where it's closed 2 days a week, it's a lot to come into. So it's a little bit of a beast. Yeah.
Yeah. And imagine like a lot of what you have to figure out is what is most important being just that they can actually execute it. More than like the actual food that you decide to make is like, can you execute this every day?
Yeah.
Sort of like the notion of like, it's more important what you can do consistently every day than one amazing thing you can do once in a while.
And then to compound that theme, back to this idea that in any school district, it could be a 3-school district, that the capabilities from school to school are very different. So we're always looking at the lowest common denominator. So it's like, okay, if there's 10 schools in the school district, yeah, this school has a tilt skillet, this school has a kettle, this school has 6 burner stove, but this school only has 2 ovens. So like that's the lowest common denominator. We know that every school has 2 ovens. So whatever we're asking the staff to prepare needs to be able to be prepared in 2 ovens, a tilt skillet. So much of what we do is figuring out too, like across the board, how can things be made, and how can they be made in a way that's not only consistent, but that's not going to be so burdensome for the staff.
Yeah. But man, you must be learning so much. That, like, I mean, this is a long play, obviously. What you're doing, going to be years and years of working on this. But that's what innovation is, right? Like what we can do today is always limited to like the technology or the capability we have. And then as that sort of utility delta increases, you can do more. But you're learning like the constraints here. I want to ask you like what you think about the future of Brigade and what you're doing, and also just generally. And I might be sort of assuming some things here. Why are schools and hospitals, some like office buildings, cafeterias, why isn't it like good food oftentimes? And is Brigade here to change that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've said it before that I think that there are a lot of limitations within institutional food that make it challenging. And I think that's a big part of the reason why it is the way it is. But I also think a big part of the reason the way it is because people who are trained to cook, trained to train other people to cook, who are chefs, do not work in the space. And more about the people who don't work in the space than the people who do. We meet all these amazing people all the time working in institutional kitchens. They're usually not chefs. The people who run the programs are usually not chefs. They're usually people with more of a dietetics background. So this is no knock to them at all. They're great people, hardworking people. But most of them are not trained to run kitchens and trained to prepare food. So again, in my opinion, and this segues into the answer to your question really, is that like if more chefs, more of the right chefs, meaning chefs that have the right character to do this work, they're patient, they don't have egos and so on, get into the institutional food space, inherently the food will be better, whether they're working for Brigade or not. One of my goals, of course, is that we can grow as big as we can grow and get as many of the right chefs in place in these positions as possible. But another one of my goals is just to change the narrative behind what it means to be a chef in general, like, or maybe a successful chef. Like being a successful chef doesn't just mean to work in fine dining. It can mean a lot of things. And I think I'm trying to get as much information out there as possible. What does it mean to be a chef in a school district? And what does that comprise of? And, in trying to entice more chefs to at least consider it. I'm not trying to persuade anyone to do this. I think make a decision to do it on your own. But again, that's such a goal of mine, is just to get more chefs in the space. And like I said, I think inherently there's no way it would lead to food changing in this space. That would also probably, the more chefs in this space would probably also lead to more questions being asked about the guidelines that exist, which would also lead to change and so on. So I think having that kind of shift, I think would be huge. And it will take time, but I really confidently feel like it will happen.
Yeah, I have to say, I mean, honestly, generally, Dan, like I've been in the restaurant industry my whole life. I'm so grateful that someone like you is taking this on, because it does need a change. And I think you've started a flywheel, right? To your point, more chefs get into this system, the more questions get asked, the more things start to slowly change. And it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to be a 10, 20 year thing, but that flywheel has started now. And I think that part's just, incredible. It's inevitable now, I think, as long as this keeps going. So like with that, like how do chefs get involved with, again, you said whether it's Brigade or not, but you're here. So like, let's just say with Brigade, how do they get involved with Brigade?
I mean, with us, we have social media. We don't do a lot of promotion beyond social media. We have our Brigade account on Instagram. I have my own personal account, which is just my name on Instagram. That's kind of how we get most of what's going on in our world out there, whether that's new projects or whether that's for hiring. We've been hiring consistently for the past several months. We'll continue to hire. We have several positions available now. Unfortunately, the way we work right now, we're hiring full-time chefs. We do have a lot of folks who reach out to us that are kind of looking to get involved in some way or another. We're not really in a position to do that. That being said, the positions we do hire for that are full-time are great positions. They're very well-paying positions with great benefits, but they're out there. They're happening. What I would say is if you're interested in this topic, if you're interested in this subject and like doing this full-time is not for you, just learn about it. Just pay attention to it. I think that's a good step to just maybe read an article, look at the guidelines, look at the nutritional guidelines, just understand them. I mean, I know a lot of chefs who have kids and they're always interested in terms of like, why are their kids getting served certain foods at school and this and that. It's just good to understand it. I think the more chefs even that understand the space, the better. Even if they're not going to say, this isn't for everyone. And I think this is like the misconception when people hear me talk is that like my expectation as a chef doing this work is that all other chefs should want to do this work. No, I don't think that at all. I do think though, if you're a chef, and especially if you're a chef who has kids and this is something that affects you, it is good to understand like the program and why it works the way it does, because I think you can also be helpful in just thinking things through, having an opinion on it. I think it's good.
Yeah. And if they do want to be hired, right, it seems like you kind of want someone that's a little bit more senior that can step into a kitchen and just start running it.
That's a good point. Yeah, we're not really, again, I think a long-term dream would be that we can hire people that are maybe just starting in the culinary world and we can train them how to cook as well. But where we're at right now, we are really looking for chefs who know how to cook. They know how to run a kitchen. They've had some managerial experience. We're just really not in a position to train people on cooking and running a kitchen. We do a lot of training for our team. We have started to do training with our team on leadership skills, mentoring, coaching, things like this. But in terms of running a kitchen, having that skill set, we're really not in a position to do that now. So yeah, we are looking for that kind of level of person. And I would say, again, that we pay very much in line with that skill set.
Are there certain regions right now, like for anyone listening, that if you live in this area?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of hiring is happening in California, really up and down the state. I would say really from the Los Angeles area to Monterey to the Bay Area. We have positions in Fresno now as well. We are hiring in New York City at the moment. So these positions continue to get updated. Like I said, I think we've had a position or positions available and advertised consistently for the past 2 years without any gaps. Right? We're going to continue to be advertising for jobs.
Cool. So it looks like they just go to chefsbrigade.com/join our team, right?
Yeah, chefsbrigade.com/join our team, or on my Instagram account, which is dan.giusti, or Brigades, which is just @Brigade. We have the links there to apply as well.
Awesome, man. Well, I'm really grateful you could take some time to come on and chat.
My pleasure. Thanks to you.
Is there anything else you want to tell chefs, cooks, people out there?
I would just say, again, I think it's important to be open-minded as to, I wasn't always this way, and working in this space has made me this way. I always had this thing where when I first started this company, and I think I've been documented saying this, which is kind of embarrassing, that like I had this vision that we were going to do this work and we were going to change the way other people thought about food. And I think in retrospect, I've changed more about the way I think about food than anyone else we probably talked to. And that's just because I realized I was very closed-minded as to what, for example, what is good food? Like, what's your definition of good food? It's very different than my definition of good food and so on. And so I think it's just really important to be open-minded of what that means, because what it means to you will mean something very different to someone else. And I don't think anyone's right or wrong. As a cook, as a chef, especially someone who has maybe the goals one day to feed a lot of people, it's just good to be open-minded to what that could mean for other people.
Yeah, absolutely. And even to your point about what is a chef, you're talking about these folks that have been working there for 20 years, that take it seriously, that really care. They're serving food. They're super organized. That sounds like a chef to me.
That's a really good point too, to being open-minded of that title and what that position is. And I was in that same boat as well. If you told me when I was 18 going to culinary school that I'd ever work in a school or an institution, I would think that's a joke. And I couldn't have been more wrong. It is an amazing career. Whether you're a chef doing the work or you're working as a staff member in a school kitchen, it's very important work. It's very fulfilling work, and it requires the same skill sets. So yeah, there's no reason that we should be looking at these things differently.
Yeah, man. Well, thank you again. And I'm stoked that we got a chance to chat.
Likewise. Thank you so much.
And we'll be spreading the word about Brigade. Thanks for tuning into the Mies podcast. The music from the show is a remix of the song Art Mirror by an old friend, hip-hop artist, Fresh Daily. For show notes and more, visit getmees.com/podcast. That's GETMEEZ.com/podcast. If you enjoyed the show, I'd love it if you can share it with your fellow entrepreneurs and culinary pros, and give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to your podcasts. Keep innovating, don't settle, make today a little better than yesterday, and remember, it's impossible for us to learn what we think we already know. See you next time.